When do we follow a rule?
I never follow a rule.
You already do, you just don't realize it.
I should know that.
First, you have to know what a rule is. According to Wittgenstein, language is based on rule following. We follow rules without realizing it.
Language is a labyrinth of paths. You approach from one side and know your way about. You approach the same place from another side and no longer know your way about.
This is poetry.
But also philosophy. He wants to say that languages don't have definitions.
Okay, that sounds a lot less poetic.
A rule stands there like a signpost. It sometimes leaves room for doubt and sometimes not. And now this is no longer a philosophical proposition, but an empirical one.
Ah, so I can learn what a rule is just by having experience.
It's not quite that simple. Just because you can experience the rules doesn't mean you can define them. Experience doesn't automatically lead to normative knowledge, which allows you to apply a rule from the top down.
In philosophy, we do not draw conclusions. But it must be like this is not a philosophical proposition. Philosophy only states what everyone admits.
So after all, we are dealing with facts. Facts are given and we can observe them.
We feel as if we had to see right into phenomena, yet our investigation is directed not towards phenomena, but rather, as one might say, towards the possibilities of phenomena. Our investigation is therefore a grammatical one.
The world is not just made up of facts from what is given. Rules are more like a grammar. However, Wittgenstein does not provide a clear explanation of his understanding of grammar. The problem with Wittgenstein is that his later writings consist only of individual remarks. His texts are protocols of thought. He uses the terms rule and grammar almost synonymously in his writings. You could say that rules make up a grammar. The term grammar is intended to designate a phenomenon of observation. Grammar also applies to all sentences that have not yet been spoken and that can only be imagined.
One can think what is not the case.
Now I have the impression that what Wittgenstein means by grammar is actually logic. At least, modal logic.
However, there are significant differences between grammar and logic. They are two completely different systems.
Well, every logical sentence can always be checked to see if it is true. Logic is unambiguous.
Grammar is not accountable to any reality. It is grammatical rules that determine meaning. And so they themselves are not answerable to any meaning, and to that extent are arbitrary.
If a grammatical rule is arbitrary, anything could be true. In that case, you can't say anything about it.
Wittgenstein wants to say that there are no further rules that determine grammatical rules themselves. He tries to explain this with the word not.
There cannot be a question whether these or other rules are the correct ones for the use of not, that is, whether they accord with its meaning. For without these rules, the word has as yet no meaning, and if we change the rules, it now has another meaning, or none. And in that case, we may just as well change the word too.
The meaning of a word depends on grammar, which is an arbitrary convention.
Why don't I call cookery rules arbitrary, and why am I tempted to call the rules of grammar arbitrary? Because cookery is defined by its end, whereas speaking is not. That is why the use of language is in a certain sense autonomous, as cooking and washing are not.
We determine its meaning without referring to another rule. A grammatical rule serves no purpose.
However, when you speak, you can have a purpose.
A grammatical rule can serve a purpose, but not on its own. For example, when someone uses languages to achieve a specific goal, he is employing grammatical rules. However, the grammatical rules are not the purpose of the speech. Wittgenstein formulates this perhaps a little more clearly.
The rules of grammar may be called arbitrary, if that is to mean that the purpose of grammar is nothing but that of language.
Grammar cannot be justified because there is no higher system that could be used to justify it. A grammatical rule is not truth-apt. It cannot be either true or false.
But you can apply a grammatical rule incorrectly.
For something to be true or false, there must be a possibility that it could be incorrect. An incorrect application of a grammatical rule is pointless, but not wrong. Grammatical rules are learned and applied.
Following a rule is analogous to obeying an order. One is trained to do so, and one reacts to an order in a particular way.
But that doesn't sound very pedagogical. Wittgenstein was a school teacher. If he taught that way, his students must not have been happy.
Wittgenstein was certainly better off at Cambridge University than at his village school in Austria. To illustrate what a language is, Wittgenstein uses the example of an explorer who encounters a foreign tribe. The explorer wants to learn the language by observing the tribe's behavior associated with it.
You already talked about this in the video about Wittgenstein's family resemblances. The link is below.
Wittgenstein returns to this example. He goes one step further.
Shared human behavior is the system of reference by means of which we interpret an unknown language. Then am I explaining what order and rule mean in terms of regularity? I do it, he does it after me, and I influence him by expressions of agreement, rejection, expectation, encouragement. I let him go his way, or hold him back, and so on. Imagine witnessing such teaching. None of the words would be explained by means of itself. There would be no logical circle.
Rules depend on how everyone behaves. Each rule depends on the situation in which it is applied. They cannot be explained in other words, thus preventing tautology. Rules are a way of life. They are based on repetition.
That makes sense. If someone only does something once, you don't know if they'll do it again.
It is not possible that there should have been only one occasion on which only one person followed a rule, on which a report was made, an order given or understood, and so on. To follow a rule, to make a report, to give an order, to play a game of chess, are customs, usages, institutions. To understand a sentence means to understand a language. To understand a language means to have mastered a technique.
I understand. When you observe how people behave, you know what rules they follow. So, thank you for watching.
Not so fast. There's another problem. If we only know how a rule has been applied so far, we don't know how it will be applied in the future.
And now someone says, the whole time they are playing a ball game and therefore are following definite rules at every throw. And is there not also the case where we play and make up the rules as we go along, and even where we alter them as we go along?
If you can't derive a rule from external criteria, you will never know for sure.
But that could lead to contradictions.
It is not the business of philosophy to resolve a contradiction by means of a mathematical or logico-mathematical discovery. Here, the fundamental fact is that we lay down rules, a technique for playing a game, and that then, when we follow the rules, things don't turn out as we had assumed, so that we are, as it were, entangled in our own rules.
But that doesn't sound good. I have the impression that the whole thing doesn't make sense.
This entanglement in our rules is what we want to understand, that is, to survey. It throws light on our concept of meaning something, for in those cases things turn out otherwise than we had meant, foreseen. That is just what we say when, for example, a contradiction appears. That's not the way I meant it.
Okay, that's not what I meant. Wittgenstein is right that you have to accept complexity where it occurs.
To properly describe and understand language, a different philosophical approach is needed.
A main source of our failure to understand is that we don't have an overview of the use of our words. Our grammar is deficient in surveyability. A surveyable representation produces precisely that kind of understanding which consists in seeing connections. Hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate links. The concept of a surveyable representation is of fundamental significance for us.
That's a challenge.
Yes, the consequence of all this is that there is no objective perspective on language. Language is only the result of human behavior. It becomes what it is when it is used. Observation takes the place of a logical system. A description of the world based on observation can lead to recognize the grammar of social behavior.
To better understand this, I recommend watching the other videos we've made about Wittgenstein. You can find the links below. In any case, thank you very much for sticking with us this far. Next time, we'll discuss whether I can have a private language.
Not just whether you can have a private language, but whether anyone can.
Please subscribe and see you next time.